They buried our names, rewrote our legacy. But through the ashes, the blood still speaks. From Moorish courts to Louisiana sugar fields, this is the true story they tried to erase. Nobility, reclassified, royalty enslaved. Yet the fire never died. It lives in the bloodline. This is more than history. It's restoration. It's reclamation. It's truth. Bloodlines of Fire. Available now on Amazon KDP.
Peace. Foundational Black American family. Today, we're gonna be talking about the unfulfilled promise. Foundational Black Americans and reparations. Now, foundational Black Americans, the descendants of enslaved people in the United States, we endured a unique trajectory of oppression without receiving direct government reparations or group-specific redress. From slavery and Jim Crow, segregation, even all the way up to redlining and mass incarceration. FBA's sufferings has often been the catalyst for broad civil rights policies. Yet, time and time again, these policies' benefits were spread to other groups, including white Americans like white women and later immigrants, leaving foundational Black Americans as the only major ethnic group to never receive targeted compensation for centuries of racial injustice. Today, we gonna provide a historical and policy analysis from the post-Civil War Reconstruction era to the present day. We're gonna highlight, bring the light to how FBA-led struggles drove landmark reforms, while the primary gains is always frequently diverted elsewhere. We're gonna contrast this with documented cases where other groups like Native American tribes, Japanese Americans, Holocaust survivors, and various refugee populations obtain direct compensation, land, programs, or legal protection specifically for harms they endured. Finally, we're gonna discuss the ongoing resistance to Black reparations, such as the fate of H.R. 40. Foundational Black Americans won't accept nothing less than an outline proposal for a lineage-based reparations framework focused on FBA descendants. Now, Reconstruction and the broken promise of reparations from 1865 to 1900. Now, in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, formerly enslaved foundational Black Americans had hope for reparative measures to help them transition into freedom. General Sherman's Special Field Order number 15 in January 1865, it had famously proposed allocating confiscated Confederate land in 40-acre plots to freedmen, coining the phrase 40 acres and a mule. Now approximately 400,000 acres along the southeast coast was set aside for settlement by about 40,000 freed slaves. However, this was a short-lived promise. President Andrew Jackson, sympathetic to the former white slave owners, overturned Sherman's order in late 1865 and returned most of the land to its pre-war white owners, nullifying the hope for land grants to foundational Black American families. The federal government's only major effort to aid free slaves. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau from 1865 to 1872 was under-resourced and impeded by policies. But to their credit, they did distribute some emergency rations, built a few schools, and attempted to protect civil rights. But it didn't offer the land redistribution a long-term economic basis that emancipated blacks was promised. In fact, some slave owners received more direct compensation than freed people. For example, in Washington, D.C., the government paid slaveholders the value of freed slaves in 1862. And guess what they gave the free foundational Black Americans? Nothing. By the end of Reconstruction in 1877, the vast majority of FBAs remained landless and economically subordinated. The white dominant society often coerced this into exploitative sharecropping and tenant farming arrangements. No federal reparations were provided for the 246 years of unpaid labor and violence under slavery. The failure to provide 40 acres and a mule was the first of many betrayals. This makes foundational Black Americans the only group to never receive compensation for an institution that built the nation's wealth, chattel slavery. During the late 19th century and into the 20th, Black Americans faced Jim Crow laws, disenfranchisement, and racial terror, with thousands of lynchings without compensation for lost properties or lives. Notably, when all those Black communities was destroyed in racial massacres such as Tulsa 1921 and Rosewood 1923, survivors received little or no restitution at the time. Florida eventually provided a small reparation package to a handful of Rosewood survivors in 1994, but such instances are rare and came decades later. Basically, the post-Civil War period set the tone. Foundational Black American claims for reparative justice was acknowledged rhetorically, then systematically denied in practice. 20th century exclusions, New Deal, and GI Bill. Now, moving into the 20th century, foundational Black Americans continue to be excluded from government benefits that other groups enjoyed, making the wealth gap even wider. During the Great Depression and New Deal in the 1930s, President Franklin D. Roosevelt administration had enacted a sweeping economic relief and social insurance programs, but many were designed or implemented in ways that disproportionately excluded foundational Black Americans. For instance, the 1935 Social Security Act. This bill initially excluded agriculture and domestic workers from old age insurance and unemployment insurance. This carve-out, pressed by Southern Democrats, meant that an estimated 60% of Black workers who predominated in farm and domestic jobs were left out of Social Security's protections. Scholars even noted that key New Deal architects aimed to placate segregationist lawmakers who were determined to block any entering wedge for federal interference with the handling of the Negro question. resulting in major programs that omitted majority of black laborers. Policies like the National Labor Relations Act and other labor laws often didn't protect jobs black workers held, and New Deal relief programs allowed local discrimination in hiring and pay. Housing policies in the New Deal era also systematically advantaged whites while disadvantaging foundational black Americans. The Federal Housing Administration, created in 1934 to spur up home ownership, openly practiced redlining, refusing to insure mortgages in black neighborhoods or even white areas near black neighborhood. From its inception, FHA's aid went almost entirely to white home buyers, as its underwriting manuals deemed blacks in integrated communities too risky. Now there's a FHA policy example that occurred in Detroit. When a developer planned a mixed area housing project, FHA would not insure loans until a concrete wall was built to segregate the black neighborhood from the new white subdivision. Such practices, replicated nationwide, meant white families received federal-backed mortgages and built home equity, while black families were largely shut out of home ownership. A disparity whose effects persist in today's racial wealth gap. The so-called New Deal's housing and lending programs essentially gave race-specific advantages to whites, though they were not framed as such. By the 1940s, these policies had drawn enduring color lines on the housing maps in America. Imagine a 1942 sign in Detroit reading, "We want white tenants in our community." Such community attitudes, reinforced by federal housing policies, kept foundational black Americans out of many neighborhoods in the mid-20th century. Another monumental benefit program that excluded foundational black Americans, the GI Bill, Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, offers a stark example of foundational black Americans serving as a catalyst for policy, but being largely cut out of its benefits. The GI Bill was enacted as World War II was ending, in no small part to reward returning veterans and prevent civil unrest. Over 1.2 million foundational black Americans served in World War II. These white supremacists had the audacity to be concerned among Southern segregationists that returning black veterans having sacrificed for the nation would leverage public sympathy to demand an end to Jim Crow. To preempt this, Southern Democrats shaped the GI Bill's administration to favor white veterans and gave local, often racist officials control. As a result, on paper, the GI Bill was race neutral. It offered college tuition, low-cost home loans, and unemployment support to all veterans. But in practice, black veterans was largely denied these benefits. Historian Ira Kitts Nelson famously documented that in many northern cities, fewer than 100 to 67,000 VA-insured mortgage loans went to non-whites. And in some deep south areas, black veterans got almost none. In Mississippi, only 2 of 3,229 VA home loans in 1947 went to black borrowers. The GI benefits were administered by local VA offices, banks, and colleges that routinely excluded or segregated foundational Black Americans. Black veterans were blocked from buying homes in suburban developments like Livingston Town due to racist covenants and lender practices. Foundational Black Americans was often steered away from universities. Many colleges refused to admit Black students despite GI Bill funding. Even the VA itself pushed Black veterans into vocational programs instead of universities, and even denied some educational claims arbitrarily. Critically, while millions of white World War II veterans used the GI Bill to climb into the middle class, obtaining college degrees, skilled jobs, home ownership, and capital, most Black veterans couldn't access that same ladder. The sweeping bill helped white Americans prosper and accumulate wealth post-war years. But it didn't deliver on that promise for veterans of foundational Black American descent. Instead, widening wealth and education gaps amongst Black Americans. Even researchers estimated that the desperate implementation of the GI Bill, it contributed significantly to the post-war racial wealth divide. This shows the wickedness of white supremacy, how they intentionally designed to deny Black gains. Do you know there was actually a white congressman that stonewalled the GI Bill unemployment payments for veterans unless Blacks were effectively excluded? He wouldn't give not even the white veterans a check unless the foundational Black American veterans was excluded from the bill. Even some Southern postmasters would refuse to deliver the forms Black veterans needed to claim jobless benefits through the GI Bill. In short, FBA veterans fought for democracy abroad and returned home to find the benefits of their service disproportionately funneled to white Americans. No reparative measures were ever taken to compensate Black veterans for this discrimination. There was no adjustment to the GI Bill to account for Jim Crow, nor subsequent federal programs to close the resulting gap, the wealth gap. Thus, mid-20th century federal policies like the New Deal, the GI Bill, illustrated a recurring pattern. Black American struggles, whether economic devastation or military service, spurred major government interventions, but those interventions were structured to prioritize others. See, the gangs of the New Deal, social safety net, and the GI Bill's prosperity were overwhelmingly claimed by whites, leaving Black citizens again excluded from broad prosperity. Indeed, these policies function as de facto affirmative actions for whites at a time when Blacks' demand for equal treatment went unmet. The civil rights storms of the 1950s and the 1960s was fast approaching, in part because the economic inequalities had become so stark. Let's move into the civil rights era. Black struggle brought benefits. The civil rights movement, led by foundational Black Americans, resulted in transformative legislations in the 1950s and 1960s. Notably, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 intended to dismantle legal segregation and racial discrimination. These victories were won through Black-led activism and sacrifice, yet they immediately became beneficial benefits to many other groups. The 1964 Civil Rights Act, for example, outlawed discrimination not only on the basis of race, but also religion, national origin, and sex. See, the inclusion of that word sex as a protected category, that was added at the last minute. They knew adding sex would weaken the bill, even though the bill still passed. They did it to sabotage foundational Black Americans from benefiting from the bill. They knew that adding sex meant that white women, a group never enslaved or legally segregated, became one of the greatest benefactories of the civil rights era protection. In the decades after the act, white women used the new anti-discrimination laws to break barriers in employment and education that had kept many professions male-dominated. They used title enforcement and later Equal Opportunity Commission actions addressing sex discrimination, open opportunities in business, academia, and government for women. In essence, laws born directly out of the foundational Black American freedom struggles were written broadly to cover minorities and women. They included immigrants from the very beginning of the Civil Rights Bill, ensuring that every other ethnic group benefit from the Civil Rights Bill the most, while foundational Black Americans receive no benefits for the rights they fought for on their homeland. Foundational Black Americans never received uniquely tailored compensation or priority, even in policies originally inspired by their plight. Affirmative action is a prime example. The concept emerged in the 1960s as a remedy for America's history of racial discrimination, primarily against foundational Black Americans. President Kennedy's 1961 executive order first mandated affirmative action in hiring to ensure equal opportunity for FBA people. However, by the late 1960s and 1970s, affirmative action policies expanded to include other underrepresented groups. In 1967, President Johnson amended affirmative action rules to cover gender, officially extending the benefits to white women. Over subsequent years, the bill grew to encompass other ethnic groups, people with disabilities, and veterans. Now this shift transformed affirmative action from a specific redress for anti-Black racism into a broader diversity of inclusion efforts. The consequence became clear by the late 20th century. Multiple studies and reports have confirmed that white women were by raw numbers the largest group to benefit from affirmative action in employment and education. Legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw noted the primary benefactors of affirmative action have been Euro-American women. In California, a state report found that after 2 decades of affirmative action in the private sector of hiring, white women held 4 more new marginal jobs than foundational Black Americans or any other minority group. Her study showed that over 57,000 white women received jobs through affirmative action, while only 10,500 foundational Black Americans received jobs through affirmative action. A U.S. Department of Labor review in 1995 concluded that 6 million women of all races had advances in their careers that wouldn't have been possible without affirmative action. by opening doors for women in higher education and professional schools. Affirmative action helped triple the percent of female physicians and led to women earning a majority of college degrees by the 2000s. Now, yeah, these were significant societal gains, but yet again, this is a demonstration of how these policies prompted up by foundational Black American activism were structured to uplift a coalition of groups and not foundational Black Americans uniquely. In the realm of university admission, affirmative action did increase Black student enrollment, but also benefited Hispanics, Asians, and Red Native American students. Moreover, because eligibility was defined by race rather than lineage, many Black beneficiaries have been immigrants or children of immigrants from Africa and the Caribbean rather than multi-generation U.S. descendants of slavery. Now, they was doing research on an Ivy League college in the 2000s, and it revealed that a disproportionate share of their Black students had recent immigrant backgrounds. Now, one study of 28 selective universities found 41% of Black students was immigrants or children of immigrants, even though that population was only 9% of the U.S. Black population. Explain that. At Harvard, Professor Gates and Geiner observed that majority of Black undergraduates were either foreign-born or mixed, and only a few were descendants of American slaves. This pattern suggests that affirmative action being implied by the government often bypassed FBAs who descended from slaves in favor of individuals who did not inherit the specific historical disadvantage of U.S. slavery and Jim Crow. Likewise, anti-poverty programs in the 1960s Great Society, such as Medicaid, food stamps, or urban renewal, was not designed to help foundational Black Americans specifically. They were designed to be race neutral, accessible to whites and other minorities as well. Race neutrality was often a deliberate strategy to make programs more palatable to the majority. For example, Head Start and Job Corps addressed poverty generally, but not the unique deprivation of segregated foundational Black American communities. The result was that resources intended to combat Black poverty was spread across the populace, sometimes provoking backlash that associated welfare with Black handouts, even as whites was the largest recipients by number. In the end, these universal programs did not close racial gaps as effectively as targeted measures might have. In summary, the civil rights era brought landmark legal equality, but no group-specific restitution for foundational Black Americans. Instead, remedies were framed in universalist or multi-ethnic terms: equal opportunity, minority outreach, diversity, diluting the focus on foundational Black American descendants of slavery. The benefits flowed to broad segments of society, including those who had not been the original targets of racist oppression. This has left many FBA advocates feeling that their community opened to the door for others while their own continuing disadvantages remain largely unaddressed. The rise of minority programs and diversity initiatives that started in the 1970s to the present day. By the 1970s and 1980s, a systematic policy shift had occurred. Programs that grew out of foundational Black American-led struggles was consciously framed as helping minorities or disadvantaged groups at large. This broadening of scopes often led to the dilution of resources for foundational Black Americans. Terms like minority-owned businesses came to include white women, Hispanics, Asian, and the red Native American, and other entrepreneurs. It's like this. Almost anyone except the white man could be considered under this minority umbrella for federal contracting or small business administration programs. In higher education and corporate hiring, diversity and inclusion initiatives expanded way beyond race to encompass gender, sexual orientation, disability status, and so much more. The list goes on. While inclusivity is cool, that wasn't what they did this for. The intended effect was that programs originally justified by the specific historical injuries of foundational Black Americans became diffused. Black educators and scientists have noted that making diversity a priority, it left Black students as an afterthought. Dr. Cato Lorenci, who has decades of experience of mentoring Black STEM students, observed in 2021 that broadening the idea of diversity had diluted the degree to which some programs help foundational Black American students. He explained that almost 95% of people in the country are now part of these different programs, once categorized like rural, first-generation college, women, veterans, etc. are included. Foundational Black Americans are often referred to as the reasons the programs are needed, but we end up having the lowest representation in them. In other words, the moral neglect of foundational Black American inequality is frequently used to justify initiatives. Yet, those initiatives then turn and serve a much wider population, sometimes barely moving the needle for the FBA community itself. This phenomenon can be seen in various domains. For instance, after the murder of George Floyd in 2020 and the ensuing racial justice protests, many institutions pledged to invest in racial equality. However, analysts show that a lot of corporate funding labeled as supporting Black lives was distributed to broad BIPOC causes or to diversity efforts that didn't specifically empower foundational Black-led organizations. The National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy found that in 2020, U.S. community foundations increased grants to Black communities, yet it still amounted to only 2.1% of total community foundations given to foundational Black Americans. Many foundations created new equity or social justice funds without directly naming foundational Black American beneficiaries, which meant resources could be spread to either people of color or anti-poverty programs generally. Some activists argue that this is a recurring pattern. Predominantly white organizations are often happy to use movement language to walk through foundations' doors opened by foundational Black American activism, effectively capitalizing on Black-led activists to secure funding that they then control. Now in academia, ethnic study departments that originated from foundational Black American studies have expanded to multi-ethnic or multicultural study programs. Again, sharing budgets and attention across groups that was intended for foundational Black Americans. And in the corporate world, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives launched in response to Black Lives Matter have pivoted to focus on gender parties or LGBTQ issues once public spotlight moved on from anti-Black racism. Now see, this minority umbrella also allowed policymakers to claim they were assisting foundational Black Americans when in fact they could meet targets by serving other groups. For example, a city government could meet its minority contracting goals through contracts with white women-owned firms or immigrants from Asia without significantly including foundational Black American-owned businesses. Similarly, university diversity offices could hire staff or admit students to boost overall minority numbers, including international students or non-Black people of color, while foundational Black American representation remained low. That's the kind of games these people playing. This race-neutral or colorblind approach in policy, often justified as political expedient, has largely failed to close persistent gaps, specifically between foundational Black Americans and the rest of society. Now, by treating this diversity thing as an abstract good, the unique harms to the FBAs have been glossed over. Critics note that programs benefiting people of color or the underprivileged, yeah, it may be worthwhile, but they are not the same as reparations because they lack the direct redress and targeted focus on the injured group. Now, let's talk about reparations and targeted restitutions for other groups. While FBA have received no reparations to date, many other groups have obtained direct compensation or special programs addressing historical injustices. These precedents illustrate that the United States and other governments have recognized certain harms and provided group-specific redress, undermining arguments that reparations are unprecedented or unworkable. I'm gonna give you several examples of exactly what I'm talking about. Let's start with the Native American treaties and settlements. Now, throughout U.S. history, Native American tribes, though subjugated to land theft, war, and genocide, at least secured treaties that recognize them as a distinct nation with reserved lands and rights. In the 20th century, the Indian Claims Commission from 1946 to 1978 adjudicated tribal claims for stolen land, resulting in financial settlements totaling over $1.3 billion paid to various tribes. In 1971, for instance, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act granted Alaska Natives 44 million acres of land and nearly $1 billion in compensation for ceded land. Tribes have also received federal support through the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Indian Health Service, which exists specifically due to treaty obligations. While these measures hardly erase all injustice, they are forms of targeted benefits based on ancestry and historical harm. Notably, some promises were broken and some compensations funds mismanaged, but the legal framework of group-specific redress is there. By contrast, foundational Black Americans, despite centuries of bondage, were not officially recognized as a group owed any land or funds after emancipation. This omission is unique among major oppressed populations in U.S. history. Now let's dive into Japanese American internment reparations. In 1988, after a prolonged campaign by Japanese American activists and allies, Congress passed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, apologizing for the World War II internment of Japanese Americans and providing $20,000 in monetary reparations to each surviving internee. Over 82,000 eligible people of Japanese descent received these payments as acknowledgement of the violation of their civil rights during 1942 and 1945. This law stands as a clear precedent of the U.S. federal government paying direct compensation to an ethnic group for a specific injustice. And the injustice only lasted for 3 years. $20,000 to the descendant. So it's most definitely worth noting that the internment redress movement explicitly cited the earlier failures to compensate foundational Black Americans as moral justification. It's complete disrespect to foundational Black Americans from the U.S. government to acknowledge and compensate Japanese descendants from past harms, but won't acknowledge the debt that's owed to the descendants who built this country. Yet, when the Civil Liberties Act passed, signed by President Reagan, it applied only to Japanese Americans. FBAs were not included, of course, since their case, slavery and segregation was considered too large and too far back, illustrating a double standard in political will. Now let's dive into Holocaust survivors and Jewish refugees. Even though the U.S. government didn't directly pay reparations for the Holocaust, most of that was largely handled by West Germany starting in the 1950s. It did facilitate some restitution to Holocaust survivors. After World War II, the U.S. enacted the Refugee Release Act in 1948 and related measures that allowed tens of thousands of Jewish survivors, along with displaced Europeans, to immigrate and receive assistance in America. Germany's reparations program paid billions of marks to Israel and to individual Jewish survivors globally. Additionally, U.S. courts and legislators have sometimes aided Holocaust survivors in recovering assets, art, insurance policies, decades later. The key point is that internationally, the Holocaust is widely seen as requiring reparations, and they were paid, acknowledging that time and scope are not insurmountable barriers to justice. If you look at it comprehensively, the foundational Black American case predates the Holocaust, and it involves actual Americans, not foreign perpetrators. Yet, no formal reparations have been extended to slavery's descendants by the U.S., highlighting a glaring inconsistency in the application of moral responsibility on the U.S. government's hand. Now let's get into other ethnic and racial justice settlements. There have been similar scale acts of redress for specific communities of color. For example, in 2015, the U.S. Congress approved payments, around $4.4 million total, to surviving Filipino American veterans of World War II who had been denied benefits. The state of Florida compensated the Rosewood Massacre survivors about $2 million in another instance. The U.S. Department of Agriculture settlements and class actions lawsuit Pickford 1 and 2 paid out about $1 billion to Black farmers discriminated against in federal loans, not framed as reparations for slavery, but as compensation for specific 20th century racism. These examples show the government could administer race-conscious compensation when motivated. Now let's touch on refugees and immigrant group programs. Over the past 60 years, the U.S. has created generous assistance programs for waves of refugees, some of which could be viewed as a form of group-targeted aid. A striking case is the resettlement of Vietnamese and other Indo-Chinese refugees after the Vietnam War. In 1975, Congress passed the Indochina Migration and Refugee Assistance Act, under which the U.S. admitted about 130,000 Southeast Asian refugees in the immediate aftermath of Saigon's fall and provided extensive support. The federal government spent at least $328 million by the end of 1975, equivalent to over $1.6 billion in today's dollar. And the initial relocation and care of these refugees included housing them on military bases, providing food, medical care, and resettlement grants. The funds was appropriated to cover employment training, English classes, and cash assistance until refugees became self-sufficient. In subsequent years, through the 1980s, hundreds of thousands more Vietnamese, Laotian, Hmong, and Cambodian refugees were welcomed, each eligible for refugees resettlement program benefits like Medicaid, jobs placement, and education. Similarly, after the Cuban Revolution in 1959, the U.S. government established programs for Cuban exiles, such as the Cuban Refugee Program, which provided financial assistance, health care, and education to Cuban refugees in the 1960s. Cubans that fled to America was given a special pass, a permanent residency. The Cuban Adjustment Act of 1966 and welfare benefits on arrival, reflecting on policies of exceptional support to a specific national origin group, largely for Cold War political reasons. More recently, in the 1990s, the U.S. accepted Bosnian War refugees, Somalian refugees, and amongst others, offering them resettlement aid under federal programs tailored to refugees. Now let's dip on over to the 21st century refugee crisis. The pattern continues. In the 2020s, America responded to new humanitarian crisis with targeted aid. Following the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, roughly 76,000 Afghani evacuees were brought to the United States, many under a special parole status. Congress quickly allocated approximately $13.3 billion for their resettlement and integration. This funding, part of the Afghanistan Supplement Appropriations Act, provided for emergency housing on U.S. bases, food, medical screening, English language classes, job training, and cash assistance to Afghan parolees. Likewise, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the U.S. admitted over 100,000 Ukrainian war refugees under the United for Ukraine parole program. It's funny how they calling these programs parole programs. Congress ensured that Ukrainian parolees are eligible for refugee benefits, appropriating hundreds of millions of dollars for housing, medical care, and other support for Ukrainians fleeing war. For instance, a 2023 spending law included $2.3 billion for assisting new refugees and explicitly extending benefits to Ukrainians arriving on parole. These responses demonstrate that when the political will exists, the U.S. can rapidly marshal vast resources for specific populations in need, whether defined by nationality or circumstances, providing them with direct aid to recover and rebuild. The above cases underscore a stark contrast. The United States have recognized and compensated the suffering of many groups, except foundational Black Americans, descendants of slavery. Native nations got land and payments. Intern Japanese Americans got apologies and checks. Even foreign nationals and recent immigrants have been given billions in support to help them start anew. Meanwhile, foundational Black Americans, we've been waiting over 150 years and ain't get a goddamn thing. No restitution for slavery, and over half a century without redress for Jim Crow and the racist violence that continue to happen to us to this day. The irony is that FBA struggles help inspire America's generosity toward others. For example, the civil rights narrative influenced human rights policies and refugee admissions. Yet, those same struggles have not yielded reparations for the original group. Now, let's expose the evil ways they be using black trauma to drive policies to benefit others. Foundational black Americans' oppression and activism don't only pave the way for other groups' gains in laws and policies. The very trauma has often been used as the moral engine for causes that then shift focus, making sure foundational black Americans don't receive any benefits off of their own struggles. This dynamic can be seen in media, philanthropy, and academia. The graphic images and stories of foundational black American sufferings, whether slavery, lynching, police brutality, or the Katrina aftermath, frequently generate public outcry and charitable giving. But how are those funds and sympathies deployed? In some instances, the symbolic capital of black pain is redirected to broader initiatives under the banner of helping marginalized people generally. For example, in philanthropy, after 2020's racial justice protests, many foundations and corporations announced major gifts to address systematic racism. However, analysts by organizations like the Bridgespan Group and NCRP found the pattern. Initial announcements touted support for black communities, but the follow-through often channeled money into broad diversity efforts or existing non-black-led charities. A 2022 report noted that only a fraction of pleaded corporate dollars actually went to black-led organizations or specific initiatives for black communities. In higher education, universities established research centers on racial equality and slavery legacies. Let's consider Harvard's $100 million fund, for instance. Yet, much of that money is earmarked for future research or educational programs, not direct aid to descendants of enslaved people of America. Academic institutions sometimes capitalize on black activism, for instance, student protests, to secure grants for diversity programs, then distribute resources in ways that benefit multiple demographics on campus. Even in the LGBTQ movement, parallels to black civil rights are frequently drawn. The phrase, gay is the new black, or when they try to make analogies between interracial marriage bans and same-sex marriage bans, trying to tap into the moral resonance of black American fight for equality. Yet again, once victories are achieved, the specific systematic issues facing black LGBTQ people may receive comprehensively less attention, when black gays often experience compounded discrimination. Feminist movements, too, borrowed literally from civil rights rhetoric. Women's rights are human rights, etc. And once sufficient policy changes, like anti-discrimination status, that primarily advance opportunities for white women. Black women who stood at the intersection sometimes saw their contributions co-opted without reciprocal support for issues like racial wealth gap or maternal mortality that uniquely impacted black women. This is not to argue these other movements were unworthy. Rather, it highlights a consistent sidelining of FBA-specific needs. Society seems more comfortable embracing a generalized notion of equality for all than addressing the debt owed specifically to foundational black Americans. As journalists, Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote, "Black people's empowerment efforts often get repackaged as colorblind or inclusive programs that are well-intended but ultimately leave foundational inequalities intact. Meanwhile, mass media periodically focus on black suffering, from Selma to Ferguson to Minneapolis, boosting their ratings and prompting declaration of actions, only for public attention to shift the next issue before concrete restitution to black communities occur. An actual contemporary example is the aftermath of the George Floyd protests. Companies and philanthropists pledged upward of $50 billion for racial justice initiatives in 2020. 3 years later, investigations found many of those pledges were unfulfilled or had morphed into other projects. Some firms quietly redirect funds to broader DEI training programs or economic opportunity funds that, while inclusive to foundational black Americans, were not exclusively focused on them. The enduring image of a black man's murder by police galvanized multiracial coalitions and even global protests. Yet, on the ground in Minneapolis and similar communities, little in terms of reparative investments materialized once the news cycle moved on. In effect, black trauma often served as the conscious trigger for America, but the relief efforts is diffused to avoid centering the victims that trauma actually happened to. Now let's put some focus on the continued oppositions to black reparations from 1980s to the 2020s. Despite the precedent and moral arguments, there have been strong and persistent resistance to reparations for FBA at the federal level. Since 1989, every session of Congress has seen the introduction of the H.R. 40, a bill to merely study the impact of slavery and the feasibility of reparations. And for some strange reason, every session has been stalled. Representative John Conyers first sponsored H.R. 40 in 1989, naming it after the 40 Acres Promise, and reintroduced it annually for nearly 30 years. After Sheila Jackson Lee took up the mantle, in 2021, H.R. 40 finally made it to the House Judiciary Committee 30 years later. Yet, even with a Democratic-controlled House, it was never brought to the floor for a vote. As of 2025, no commission has been established. The bill remains a symbol of congressional reluctance to confront the issue. Lawmakers have often targeted reparations as a political third rail, fearing voters' backlash or labeling it impractical. Now indeed, public opinion constantly titled against cash reparations. A Pew Research Center's survey in 2021 found that only 30% of Americans supported compensating descendants of enslaved people, while 68% opposed it. Support for reparations is deeply split along racial and partisan lines. Roughly 77% of black Americans favor it, but only 18% of white Americans do. Over 90% of Republicans are against reparations, whereas Democrats are roughly evenly divided on the question, so they say. This substantial opposition among the majority group, white Americans, has made elected officials weary of championing reparations at the national level. Opponents of black reparations commonly argue that today's taxpayers are not responsible for historical slavery, or that it would be unfair to give benefits based on race. Others claim that universal anti-poverty programs are a better approach, even though, as noted, those have not closed racial wealth gaps. There's also the logistical argument, how to fund what could be a multi-trillion-dollar endeavor and how to determine eligibility. However, these challenges have not prevented the U.S. from allocating huge sums to other emergencies and groups when politically desired, as seen with COVID-19 relief, $5 trillion, war spending, or refugee resettlement. Notably, even as direct reparations stall, the harm of the past continue to compound in the present. The legacy of redlining is evident in the fact that black home ownership and wealth remain drastically lower than whites. Decades of mass incarceration since the 1970s, devastating foundational black American communities through lost income and family instability. Yet, initiatives to rectify that, like overturning drug conviction records or economic development of heavily policed neighborhoods, have been piecemeal. Until the federal government has taken steps ostensibly to address racial inequality, it often does so under race-neutral guise. For example, Opportunity Zones in 2017 was sold as helping distressed areas, many minority blacks, but in practice offered tax breaks to investors with few requirements to benefit existing residents. Student debt relief, proposed in 2022, was touted as a policy that would especially help black borrowers who have heavy debt on average. But it was designed as a race-neutral income-based policy and has been blocked by courts. The pattern of shying away from directly naming or targeting foundational black American descendants of slavery persists, even when evidence shows that universal policies alone are inefficient. They don't benefit foundational black Americans. At local and state levels, there's a burgeoning movement to address this void. In recent years, municipalities like in Vinston, Illinois, and states like California have explored their own reparations plans. In Vinston implements a program granting eligible black residents housing assistance, funded by a tax on cannabis, a small-scale step that supporters acknowledge is more symbolic than sufficient. It offers $25,000 housing grants to a few dozen families as redlining compensation. California's legislation established a reparation task force in 2020, which in 2023 issued a comprehensive report recommending state-level reparations, including monetary payments to eligible black Californians for injustice ranging from housing discrimination to over-policing. The California task force proposed, for example, roughly $500,000 in compensation per person for long-standing wealth and income losses, a substantial sum that nonetheless covers only specific harms in one state. Whether California or other states will enact these recommendations remains uncertain. Political opposition and budget funding pose hurdles. Importantly, most importantly, The task force insisted on lineage-based eligibility. Only those who can trace descendants from U.S. slavery or a free black person in the 19th century, reflecting a growing consensus among reparation advocates that the remedy must focus on foundational black Americans rather than a broad racial category. This lineage approach was influenced by grassroots movements, which have in past decades pushed the public discourse toward specific lineage benefits. Even so, without federal involvement, any state local efforts will be limited in scope and funding. Activists maintain that the federal government, which sanctions slavery and segregation, must lead with a national reparations program, specifically for foundational black American lineage. We're moving toward a targeted reparations framework for FBA. Given the historical context and the shortcomings of broad equity efforts, policy experts have outlined what a meaningful reparations program for foundational black Americans could look like. The key principles, as drawn from leading scholars like William A. Doherty Jr. and Christian Mullen, authors from Here to Equality, include specifically direct compensations to the descendants of slaves in America, lineage-based eligibility. Reparations should be limited to those who can document ancestry to at least one person enslaved in the United States prior to abolition in 1865, and you must be black right now. This criterion zeroes in on the descendants of the exact population that was enslaved and subsequently victimized by Jim Crow. Some proposals add that you have to be born a foundational black American, not just identify as one, to avoid recent immigrants claiming reparations, and also to avoid white people claiming they have a great-great-great-great-grandfather who was a slave. Lineage-based programs would exclude black immigrants who arrived voluntarily post-abolition and who have their own unique stories, but not the specific claims against the U.S. government. This approach aligns reparations with the concept of an inherited debt owed to the families of the enslaved, just as descendants of wronged Native Americans or Japanese internees were eligible in those programs. Federal leadership and funding. The scale of racial injustice, especially the economic damage from slavery and segregation, is so great that only the federal government has the capacity to fund reparations at the necessary level. Estimates for closing the black and white wealth gap, a common target for reparations, run into trillions of dollars. Doherty and Mullen point out that a multi-trillion-dollar expenditure is feasible for the federal government, spread over years, whereas no state or city budget could absorb that. Thus, while local experiments can lead the way, ultimately, Congress would need to authorize substantial funding, potentially through some combination of direct appropriations, trust funds, and programmatic spending to meet the debt. The federal role is also justified because it was the federal law, the Constitution, Supreme Court rulings, etc., that enabled slavery and segregation, making Uncle Sam the culpable party, that needs to formally apologize and provide redress. Multiple forms of reparations, with cash at the core. Most experts agree that cash payments or other forms of direct wealth transfer must be a central component to give descendants the agency to improve their own conditions. However, reparations could also include debt forgiveness, subsidized education, housing grants, business capital, and more effectively, a portfolio of benefits. In surveys, Black reparations supporters see education scholarships and home buying assistance a very helpful form of repayment alongside with the cash at the core, no doubt. A comprehensive plan might, for example, wipe out student loan debt for eligible individuals, provide down payment assistance, or even housing allocation, ironic echoes of 40 acres and the mule, and guarantee tuition-free college or vocational training, all lineage-based. One idea is the creation of a trust account or endowments for Black children, sometimes called baby bonds, to ensure wealth building across generations. The aim would be to both compensate for past losses and diminish future inequalities by building structural support. Scale to eliminate racial gaps. Reparations should be quantitatively sufficient to truly repair the harm. Doherty suggests the goal should be to eliminate the racial wealth gap in its entirety. Currently, the median white family has roughly 8 to 10 times the wealth of the median Black family, a result of compounded injustice. To erase that gap by bringing Black wealth up, not by taking anything from others, but by federal investment, might cost on the order of 10 to 14 trillion, Doherty's estimate. While staggering, this is comparable to what the U.S. spent on COVID-19 relief or over decades on the military. The psychological component is also critical. A reparations plan should include a formal acknowledgement and apology from the U.S. government for slavery and discrimination. This helps provide a sense of closure and historical reckoning, distinguishing reparations from mere poverty programs. It will say, in effect, we harmed you specifically, and now we set it right. Alongside material redress, such acknowledgement is vital for reconciliation. No substitution by broad programs. Experts caution that reparations must not be watered down into racial equality. Initiatives that help all minorities or all low-income people. While those may be valuable, they are not reparations for foundational Black Americans. For example, if a city plans to address past housing discrimination, just create more affordable housing open to anyone. That fails to satisfy reparations. It might be good policy, but it's not paying the debt to the victims of slavery in America. A genuine reparations program would explicitly compensate those foundational Black American families who were redlined or whose ancestors were denied homes, etc., and their descendants. In short, the beneficiary class must be clearly defined as the victims and their progeny of the injustice in question. Race-neutral or extremely diffuse policies, no matter how well intended, do not meet this standard. Now, how are we going to prevent future injustice? Cause a lot of people hating cause foundational black Americans are on code. Some frameworks include measures to guarantee non-repetitions of the harms. This could mean strengthening civil rights enforcements, change to school curricula to accurately teach foundational black American history, preventing the whitewashing of past crimes, and economic reforms that prevent exploitation. While not reparations per se, such measures would ensure the legacy of reparations programs is lasting equality, not a one-time payout followed by business as usual. Essentially, America would have to commit to ongoing justice for FBA, the same way it has legally committed to honoring Native treaties or supporting certain groups. Implementing a full federal reparations programs will undoubtedly face challenges, politically, logistically, bureaucratic. But proponents note that the U.S. has done large-scale hard things before. It could create a reparations bureau to manage claims, similar to the Veterans Administration or Bureau of Indian Affairs. It could require genealogical documentation, which in the digital age is increasingly accessible. Many foundational black Americans can trace lineage to at least the 1870 census record, the first after slavery. The program could be funded through various mechanisms: government debt financing, spreading costs over time, tax on extreme wealth, recouping some benefits of slavery that follow to certain families, corporations, or even asset transfers, land grants, etc. Importantly, economists argue that reparations will stimulate the economy, injecting capital into communities that have faced credit and investment gaps, could boost compensations, entrepreneurships, and productivity nationwide. A comprehensive reparations plan for FBA will be a profound step toward closing the chapter of legal sanctioned white supremacy in America. It will signal that the country is finally addressing the only group left behind in the terms of direct acknowledgement of historic injustice. As this report has shown, every other major oppressed community has received something. The time is overdue for foundational black Americans to receive their due. Polls show younger Americans are more open to reparations than older ones, suggesting that public opinion may shift over time, especially as the national conversation continues. For example, through academic work, advocacy, and local reparations experiments. Conclusion of all this: for over 150 years, foundational black Americans have been fighting for freedom, equality, and restitution. They forced America to live up to its ideals through the civil rights movement, yet the specific debt for centuries of exploitation remains unpaid. Meanwhile, the story of American policy is replete with instances of the nation doing the right things for others, giving land to settlers but not freed slaves, compensating intern citizens, rescuing refugees of foreign wars, enforcing minority rights for various groups. The glaring exception is the very people whose stolen labor and oppression were foundational to the country's wealth and whose struggle for justice have benefited all. This exceptional denial has contributed to the persistence of stark racial disparities in wealth, health, education, and incarceration. Reparations for foundational Black Americans is not a call for a handout or special preference. It's a long-delayed payment of a debt and an investment in true equality. It will acknowledge that the United States' preposterous democracy was built and launched on the backs of foundational Black Americans and their descendants, and that the nation's post-slavery policies often continue to extract and suppress Black wealth. It will also finally align America's practice with its principles by targeting foundational Black Americans with the same seriousness given to other groups who suffered grave injustice. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. himself wrote in 1963, the promise to foundational Black American people was a bad check, marked insufficient funds. Reparations would be how the country makes good on that check. Until such targeted measures are taken, foundational Black Americans will continue to be used as idea starters for reform that rarely reach or benefit foundational Black Americans. The historic and ongoing exclusion of FBA from direct redress remains a fundamental injustice and a missing piece in America's policy landscape. In closing, the story of FBA and reparations is one of a unique struggle that inspires a nation to better itself in many ways. Foundational Black Americans now demand that the nation finally better itself for those whose struggle made it possible. The case for reparations is thus not only a matter of justice for foundational Black Americans, but a necessary step for America as a whole to heal, reconcile, and move forward with integrity. If you made it to the end, you know one thing. Your boy FBA, or your man FBA Stoic, appreciate you. Hit that like and subscribe. I appreciate your patience because this was a long one, but this one was very enlightening because we need to know demanding reparations ain't begging. Everybody getting a slice of the pie except us. Get the book, Bloodlines of Fire. It's about the bloodline and the lineage of the foundational Black American family, how we started from royalty, ended up in slavery, and it's all from my family tree. Peace, my foundational Black American family. I'ma holla at y'all in the next one.
They buried our names, rewrote our legacy, but through the ashes, the blood still speaks. From Moorish courts to Louisiana sugar fields, this is the true story they tried to erase. Nobility, reclassified, royalty enslaved. Yet the fire never died. It lives in the bloodline. This is more than history. It's restoration. It's reclamation. It's truth. Bloodlines of Fire. Available now on Amazon KDP.